They came out to Death Karath on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were the days I restocked the mineral supplements, and I was elbow deep in a crate of bone ash blocks when their transport set down on the dirt pad outside. 3 of them. Imperial Assessment Corps. The dark green uniforms, the brass insignia on the collars, the kind of polished boots that have never walked a muddy pen. I watched them through the triage bay window before they knocked. They had the posture of men who had already made up their minds. I've been doing frontier veterinary work for 31 years. 22 of those years at Death Karath sits at the eastern edge of the Varath contested reaches. About 40 minutes by air transport from the nearest settlement of any size. Before me there was a woman named Cassil Vorith, who ran the post for 18 years, and before her, a man whose name the station records had reduced to an initial and a surname. Post has been operating in some form for over 60 years. It is not glamorous work. The pens are stone and timber. The roof of the main triage bay is corrugated alloy that sings in wind and leaks in hard rain, and the supply runs come every 3 weeks if the weather is good, and every 5 if it isn't. I have one medical assistant, a young man named Davin Selke, who is 26 and has been with me 4 years, and who is, by general agreement, too talented for a posting this remote. I have told him this twice. He has not transferred. I have stopped telling him. Work itself I do not mind the simplicity of. What I minded in the early years was the feeling that the simplicity was imposed rather than chosen. That this level of resourcing was what the territorial authority thought, tier, veterinary medicine deserved, rather than what it required. I stopped minding that somewhere in the 2nd decade. You either make your peace what you have, or you spend your career in a state of grievance about what you don't, and the animals in the pens don't benefit from the grievance. They benefit from the work. The contested reaches earn that name because the Varath Concordat and the Death Solara territorial authority have been arguing about the exact placement of the eastern border for approximately 40 years. The argument has never quite become a war, but has never quite stopped simmering either. Death Karath sits in the contested strip, which means it receives neither enough support from the territorial authority, which considers it someone else's problem, nor from the Concordat, which considers it outside its formal jurisdiction. What it receives is the work that falls through the gap between those two positions. Large animals cross the border markers and become technically the problem of neither party until they are undeniably the problem of both. When that happens, they call us. We are the last option, which is a position I have made my peace with over the years. The station itself is modest. 3 animal pens, primary, secondary, and a 3rd smaller one we use for isolation cases. Triage bay with wide south-facing doors built for large animal access. A treatment room. A supply room that is never as full as I would like it to be. A small kitchen and 2 sets of quarters in the attached residential unit, mine and Devon's. There is a communications array on the roof that works reliably in good weather and intermittently in bad, and a backup system that works about 60% of the time overall. I have been requesting an upgrade to the backup system for 6 years, and have been told each time that it is in the budget review. I have stopped expecting it. Since he came across the border markers, 9 weeks before the assessors arrived. She came in at night, moving low and slow along the dry creek bed that runs south of the station, and she was already in the secondary pen when Davin found her at dawn. He came and got me without saying a word. Just stood in the doorway of the equipment room until I looked up, and then jerked his head toward the south pens. I have worked with him long enough that this was sufficient. She was copper bronze. That was the first thing I registered. The color of old metal left in weather. The scales overlapping in the dense, armored pattern that the Varath line carries, different from the smoother scoots of the western breeds. She was medium-sized for an adult female, though I would learn later that she was considered small by Varath standards, which was part of what had brought her here. She lay along the south pen wall, and the angle of her left wing told me immediately that something was wrong with it. Both wrong angles, actually. A fracture at the first wing rib and another at the third, and both had been knitting badly because she had been moving on them too long. Belly was distended. The scales over the abdomen parted slightly in that way that happens in late gestation. 8 eggs, maybe 10. Not be certain from the doorway. She watched me come into the pen. Her eyes were amber, very pale amber, almost gold, the horizontal pupil of the Vareth. She tracked me the way a wild animal tracks a potential threat. Not aggression, exactly, calculation. She was deciding what I was and what I was likely to do. I moved the way I always move in a pen with an unknown animal, slow, no direct eye contact. My center of gravity kept low. I stopped about 4 body lengths away, set my kit on the ground, and sat down in the dirt beside it. I did not approach her, I just sat. Davin stood at the pen gate. After a while he said quietly, "She hasn't eaten, I can see that. The secondary pen doesn't have a heat source." I know, I sat with her for 2 hours that first morning. I did not try to examine her. I did not try to do anything except be present. She watched me the whole time. Somewhere in the second hour she shifted very slowly and refolded the damaged wing more carefully. And I understood that she had registered my presence as something that was not a threat. I sent my intake report to the Territorial Authority that afternoon. Species line, Varath, copper-bronze variant, adult female, late-stage gestation. Injuries, bilateral wing rib fractures, left first and third, badly knitted from extended movement. Preliminary condition, compromised but stable. I requested additional heat units and a supplemental feed ration, and noted that the wing ribs would need addressing before she could safely be moved. I did not request guidance on disposition, because I already knew what the Territorial Authority would say, and I wanted to at least complete the intake examination before they said it. The additional heat units arrived in 3 days. Devon and I moved them into the secondary pen in 2 trips, which involved a certain amount of patient negotiation with Varath Sen. Watched the whole operation with her pale amber eyes and made a low sound in her chest. Not quite a growl, but close enough that Davin kept glancing at me. I kept moving at the same pace and did not look at her directly. The sound stopped when we activated the first unit and the warmth began spreading across the pen floor. She put her head down. That was when I understood that she was exhausted. Not only the injury exhaustion I had already recognized, bone fractures are painful and slow, and they drain an animal in ways that are hard to overstate, but something deeper than that. She had been moving for a long time. Whatever had happened to her, wherever she had come from, she had been carrying those eggs and that injury through open country for longer than she should have had to, and she had found the first warm, still place available, and stopped. That place was Death Carath. That place was my secondary pen. The assessors came 6 days after that. They introduced themselves by title, not name, which is always a sign. The senior assessor, a heavy-set man with close cropped gray hair and the practiced air of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that it has become merely information, looked at my intake documentation, looked at Varath Seneth through the pen gate, and told me that the situation was non-viable. The injuries will not permit a safe birth event, he said. The eggs will likely not survive the extended transit stress in any case. This is a resource allocation question. I waited. Concordat has been notified of her presence and is not in a position to send a recovery team across the border at this time. He said this with the faint air of someone reporting a logical conclusion. We're recommending cessation. Cessation, I said. She's suffering. Prognosis is poor. The eggs. I understand what cessation means, I said. I've been doing this work for 31 years. He looked at me with the tolerance a man extends to a subordinate who is about to argue and whom he has already decided to ignore. The cost-benefit analysis. I'll note your recommendation in the file, I said. Thank you for coming out. He looked at Varath Sen again. She was watching him with those pale amber eyes, not having moved. He said, "She's been assessed, Vet Cecil. Whatever you're planning to do here, the resources allocated to this post don't cover extended critical care for a non-viable case." I'll work within the existing allocation, I said. I always do. He made a note. The 3 of them left. Their boots were still clean when they got back in the transport. Avon came to stand beside me at the pen gate. After a moment he said, "Non-viable, that's what they said." He was quiet. Then he went and got the afternoon feed ration and took it into the pen. I watched him do it. He moved, the same way I had taught him, slowly. No direct eye contact. Placing the food at a respectful distance and then backing to the gate. Varath Sen watched him the whole time. Then she put her head down and ate. I went back to my office and did the paperwork I had been putting off, and tried not to think about the word non-viable. And how smoothly it had come out of that man's mouth, as though it described something straightforward and settled, figure in a column that simply did not balance. The thing is, he was not entirely wrong about the prognosis. I knew that. The wing rib fractures were significant, and the second one, the outer third rib, had been knitting for long enough that there was already calcification in the wrong geometry. If the birth event required sudden movement or defensive wing use, that fracture could fully shear. A fully sheared outer wing rib in a late-stage gravid female is a serious complication. The egg's viability was genuinely uncertain. Transit stress in late gestation does things to clutch development that I can estimate, but not predict with any confidence. But she had eaten. She had traveled however far she had traveled, crossed a border in the dark, carried those eggs and that injury through open country, and found a warm corner and put her head down. She was not a creature that had given up. That meant something to me. I had a colleague, a large animal vet named Rastan Kohal, who worked the Southern Territory for about 15 years before he retired, who used to say that the thing you're watching for, in any case that looks borderline, is the animal's relationship to its own existence. Whether it is trying, not whether it is cheerful, not whether it is in pain, not whether the numbers look good, whether it is still making the small continuous effort of being alive and intending to stay that way. That is the thing, he said, you cannot get from an assessment at 3 meters through a pen gate. That is the thing you can only see if you sit down in the dirt and watch for a while. Varath Sene was trying. The fractured wing carried wrong, and the journey had cost her something significant, and she had laid those eggs in a strange pen, with a strange human, 2 arms lengths away, and she was trying. The rest was a question of what resources I could put in service of that effort. I sat in my office and worked out what those resources were, and made some decisions. I had 3 supplemental heat units now. I had bone broth concentrate, which is expensive, and which I use sparingly on high-priority cases. I had wound irrigation solution, adjustable splinting materials I had ordered 2 years ago for exactly this kind of structural injury, and had never used on anything quite this large. I had a set of draconic anatomy references bought with my own money from an academic press 7 years ago, when the territory had started seeing more Varath crossings, because the territorial authority had declined to fund them. I had Devon, who was quick and careful, and who had not, once in 4 years, told me a case was non-viable, without asking what we were going to do about it. I also had time. Not unlimited time, but time. The eggs were not going to arrive tomorrow. The calcification in the third rib was going to make the fracture more stable over the coming weeks. Not less. It was already knitting, just in the wrong geometry, and I was not going to try to re-break it. What I was going to do was support the structure around it, so that when the birth event came, she had the best mechanical advantage I could give her. It took me 3 evenings to design the splinting rig. I adapted the adjustable armature from the materials I had, added a shaped pad made from compressed foam sheeting and canvas, and fitted the whole thing with 2 anchor points that used the pen's south wall as a brace, so that some of the compression during significant movement would be taken by the wall rather than by the rib. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing they publish in veterinary journals. It was the kind of thing you make when you have what you have, and the animal in front of you is what it is. The design process was the most engaged I had been in months. I do not say this with any pride. It is simply true that this kind of problem, an engineering problem wrapped around a medical one, is the kind I find absorbing. The constraints were considerable. I could not use the standard external fixation methods designed for this size of animal, because I did not have the hardware, and ordering it would have required a justification I was not sure the territorial authority would approve. I could not attempt an internal repair of the fractures, because the gestational state made any procedure with significant anesthetic risk inadvisable, and I did not have the equipment for the level of precision that internal work on a wing rib would require in any case. What I had was support, warmth, time, and a supply room of adaptable components. What I needed to design was something that would take the mechanical load off the damaged structure without restricting her movement in a way that distress her or compromise the birth event when it came. I sketched 4 versions before I arrived at the one I built. Devan reviewed the sketches on the second evening and noted correctly that the third version had an anchor placement that would create a lever problem if she moved suddenly to the right. I revised it. He reviewed the revision and said nothing, which from him means it is sound. Getting the rig onto her took 2 days of patient work. Varath Sen was not hostile, but she was cautious and she had good reason to be. I did not rush. I spent the first day simply sitting with her while she grew accustomed to the smell of the materials. I let her examine the armature with her nose, which she did at considerable length, her breath stirring the foam padding in short, warm gusts. On the second day, I positioned it near her left wing without attempting to attach it. She watched it for a long time, amber eyes moving from the rig to me and back, and then she put her head down. On the third day, I fitted the first anchor point. She went still when I touched the damaged wing rib area. Her chest vibrated with that low sound. I kept my hands steady and kept moving, and she held still. Davin stood at the gate with the second component and handed it to me when I reached for it, without either of us speaking. When it was done, she turned her head and looked at the rig for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I don't know what I was to her at that point. Something that kept coming back. Something that did not hurt her. I went and sat against the south wall, and she watched me for a while and then lowered her head and dozed. I said very quietly, "There you go." Davin heard me from the gate. He said nothing, but I heard him shift his weight. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That is the thing about this kind of work. The dramatic version is for people who do not do it. The real version is small and daily and unglamorous. You show up. You check the rig. You check the feed. You check the eyes and the scales and the belly. You sit in the pen for a while because being present matters and an animal knows when you are not. I have had people ask me, over the years, what it is about the sitting that matters. They mean it as a practical question. Why allocate time for what looks like doing nothing when there are supplies to order and records to write and other patients needing attention? I have tried to answer this in practical terms, which is usually the right approach with people who ask that question. The sitting establishes a baseline. It gives you a read on the animal's resting state, their breathing, their alertness, their comfort with your presence in the space, that you cannot get from the examination itself, because the examination changes what you're reading. It makes you familiar to them in a way that passive contact does not. It is time spent, but it is not time wasted. That is the practical answer. True answer is simpler. An animal that is frightened and alone in a strange pen is suffering a kind of distress that is not addressed by correct nutrition and appropriate temperature. The company of a familiar presence is medicine, and it is medicine I can provide without drawing from the supply allocation, so I provide it. I do not think this is complicated. Sen began to relax by degrees. Not quickly. She was a wild animal with the instincts of one, and the instinct of a gravid wild female in a strange pen is caution. But degrees accumulate. By the end of the second week, she no longer watched me from the moment I entered. She tracked me, with a different quality, not threat assessments, something closer to acknowledgement. The one who comes every morning. All right. I talk to her sometimes, the way I talk to most of my patients. Not in the Varath tongue, of which I have only a handful of functional signals. I'm not a threat. I'm going to touch you now, and 1 or 2 others. Mostly I talk the way you talk to something you're working on, a running account of what I was doing and why. The scales over the shoulder joint here are compressed. I'm going to apply some warmth. That's going to feel different. Hold on, she held on. In the third week, Davin came to me in the evening, with the Varath anatomy references spread on the small table in the treatment room, a notepad beside him, filled with his careful, close-printed handwriting. He had been reading on his own time about clutch development under stress conditions. He had found a section on shell wall, thickening as a compensatory mechanism, the way a clutch, under thermal or mechanical stress, can develop thicker shells that delay hatching but improve overall viability, and how this presentation is often misread on surface examination as non-viable calcification. He had written out the relevant passage and drawn a diagram comparing normal shell wall measurement ranges with the stress compensation range. Both cross table to me without comment. I read them. I looked at the diagram. I thought about the assessors and their assessment, and about what they had actually examined, which was the surface of the shells from outside the pen gate at a distance of about 3 meters. Have you been doing percussion checks? I asked. Since you mentioned it 2 weeks ago, he said. Yes. And movement in 4, maybe 5. The third one from the left is ambiguous. The response is irregular, which could mean delay development, or could mean strong development, but an unusual position. He paused. I've been logging it twice daily. I looked at him for a moment. He had the expression he gets when he has been working something out for a while, and is being careful about how he presents it. Because he has learned, over 4 years, that I don't like conclusions delivered before the reasoning is laid out. I do not think this is a flaw in him. I think it is a habit he developed to work well with me, which is a different thing entirely. Good, I said. Keep doing that. He kept doing that. I want to be clear that I am not a heroic person. I have been accused of stubbornness, which is fair. I have been told, more than once, that I make things harder than they need to be. My former colleague Petra Dane, who worked this post with me for 6 years, before transferring to a better resourced facility closer to the capital, once said that I was congenitally unable to let a thing die that still had fight left in it. She meant it as both a compliment and an explanation for why she was leaving, and I understood both meanings. There was no bitterness in it. She was right about the distance from the capital, and she was right about me. What I am is someone who takes the work seriously. The work is, when something living comes into your care, you attend to it. You give it what you have. You do not stop giving it what you have, because somebody else has run a cost-benefit analysis on its existence and found it wanting. That decision belongs to the animal, or to the body, or to whatever force governs these things. It does not belong to the assessor, and it does not belong to me. I have held to this for 31 years, and I do not expect to revise it. So I kept showing up every morning, every evening, the rig check, the feed, the temperature records, the 30 minutes sitting in the pen. Varath Sen and I had arrived at something by the 4th week. I would not call it friendship, because that is a word implying an equality of comprehension that I could not honestly claim. She was a wild dragon, and I was a human vet at a crumbling frontier post, and the distance between those two things is real and should be respected. But we had arrived at something, a working understanding. She knew my footstep on the pen floor. She knew the smell of the bone broth ration and of the wound irrigation solution, and I think, of me specifically, the particular human-animal disinfectant combination that is the smell of this work. When I came in, she would orient toward me, not with alarm, just with the quiet acknowledgement of something that has noted a familiar presence and found it acceptable. That was enough for me. In its way, it was everything. The assessors came back in the 4th week. The same senior man, one of the same colleagues, and a third assessor I didn't recognize who had the look of someone brought along to provide additional documentation. They stood at the pen gate. Varath Sen was in her usual position along the south wall, the heat units warm, the splinting rig visible along her left side. The eggs had been laid the previous week, 7 of them, copper-toned and heavy-shelled, settled in the corner under the heat units in the nest of compressed bedding I had built from materials in the supply room. The senior assessor looked at the rig for a long time. Then he looked at me. I note you've expended significant time and materials, he said. I note that too, I said. The eggs are still assessed as non-viable. They haven't hatched yet, I said. That assessment will be more accurate after they do. He made the expression of a man who is cataloging an argument he has already decided not to engage with. Vet Cecil, you are aware that this facility's resources are being managed within allocation, I said. I have the records. You're also aware that the Concordat has not responded to the notification of her presence, which means she is, technically, an unclaimed. She is a patient, I said. She is in my care. That is what I am aware of. He looked at the pen again. Sen was watching all of this with her amber eyes, having not moved and not made the chest sound. The third assessor said something in a low voice to the senior man. The senior man looked at the corner. 7 eggs, visible. 7, I said. She laid 7. I have temperature records on all of them going back to the day they were laid. Cushion records on the ones showing development. If they don't hatch, he said, this becomes a waste disposal question. If they do hatch, it's a different question entirely. He made another note. They left. Devon came and stood beside me. This was becoming a habit we had between us, and I recognized it for what it was. Two people who were doing something they had been told not to do, standing together in the aftermath of having been told it again, not discussing whether to continue but simply standing together in the space that the conversation had left. Waste disposal question, he said very quietly. Yes, he said that in front of her. I noticed. We were quiet for a moment. Varath Sen had lowered her head after the transport lifted off. Her neck curved in that long, slow arc toward the eggs. The protective architecture of a gravid female, the body keeping its own counsel about what it was and what it was doing. Cushion records, Davin said. I'll want them in the main file. They're already there, he said. I knew they were. I went back inside. The 6th week was the hardest. I had been managing on short sleep, doing check-ins at 2-hour intervals overnight on the eggs, which were showing signs of imminent hatching in 4 of the 7. The shell texture was changing, the internal movement more frequent, the temperature differential across the clutch beginning to even out in the way that happens in the final days. I was tired in the deep bone way that comes from sustained attention over a long period, the kind of tired that sleep addresses but does not cure, because the root of it is not hours but the weight of what you're attending to. On the 4th day of that week, I received a formal notification from the Territorial Authority acknowledging my continued expenditure of station sources and advising me that any adverse outcomes would be noted in the facility's annual review. I acknowledged the notification and filed it. I went back to the pen. What I remember most from that 6th week is the quality of the late afternoon light. The secondary pen has wide doors on the south side, built for large animal access, and in the late afternoon the sun comes through them at a low angle and crosses the floor in a wide band. The heat units were running, and the combination of unit warmth and direct sunlight made the pen genuinely pleasant. A pocket of ease in the cold, scrubby landscape of the reaches. Varath Sen lay in that afternoon light the way I have seen dogs lie in patches of sun, with evident, uncomplicated pleasure, her eyes half closed, the scales along her flank shifting through copper and bronze, and at certain angles, old gold. The eggs were in the corner, their temperature steady. She lay between me and them, not deliberately, just as a matter of where she had chosen to be. I sat with her in those afternoons, and thought about nothing in particular. After 31 years of this work, the ability to sit with an animal in a quiet pen in the late sun, and not need it to be something other than what it is, that is among the things the has given me. It is not a small thing. Sometimes Davin sat with me. He would bring 2 cups of whatever he had made in the small kitchen off the treatment room and set one near me without comment and take his own to the other side of the pen. And we would sit in the warmth with Varath Sen between us and not say much of anything. He is good at quiet. Shh. I value that quality more than most people realize as a quality. He has never asked me why we were doing this instead of what the assessors had recommended. He did not need to ask, and I did not need to explain, and that mutual understanding is something I expect to think about for a long time. I did ask him once in the 3rd week what had made him stay at this post. Not what had made him take the position originally. People take remote postings for all kinds of reasons, and I know mine well enough. But what had made him stay past the initial period, and then past the point where a transfer would have been straightforwardly available to him? He thought about it for a while. Then he said that the work here was real, in a way that was hard to describe, and that he thought he would miss that. I understood what he meant. Work is real when the thing in front of you needs something from you specifically, and you are there to give it. That quality is not guaranteed by proximity to a capital or by a well-stocked supply room. It is a quality of the case. First egg cracked on a Thursday night. Devan came and knocked on my quarters door at 11:20, not urgently, with the specific quality of knock that means something is happening, and I should come. I was dressed and at the pen in 4 minutes. The crack was at the blunt end of the egg, which is typical. The hatchling works from inside at the point of maximum shell curvature to maximize mechanical advantage. The crack was about 8 centimeters, clean-edged, and there was movement behind it. I could see the shift of something dark against the lighter interior membrane. Varath Sen was awake and watching the egg from about 2 body lengths away, her neck extended, very still, amber eyes intent and soft at the same time, intent with the calculation gone out of it, something more essential underneath. She did not look at me when I came in. She was entirely focused on the egg. Davin and I sat down on the pen floor out of the way. On the far side from the nest, we did not speak. We did not approach. This was not our moment, it was hers. And the hatchlings. And our role was to witness it, which is a different role and a quieter one. It took 2 hours. The first hatchling worked the shell open with a patience that I found moving, for reasons I could not entirely explain. There is something about watching a new thing come into the world that does not diminish with repetition, not in my experience. It emerged fully at 1:30 in the morning. Small, copper-toned, visibly scaled even at this stage. The wings folded flat and damp against its body, the head slightly oversized in the way of hatchlings. It lay in the broken shell for a moment and was completely still. Then it made a sound, very small, very clear, a single vocalization between a chime and a breath, entirely unlike anything I had heard before. Varath Sen crossed the pen in one long, careful movement and lowered herself around the hatchling without touching it, her neck curving in that protective arc. The small creature turned toward her. That was all. That was the whole thing, and it was everything. Devon, sitting on the pen floor beside me, let out a long, slow breath. Over the next 36 hours, 3 more eggs hatched. The other 3 did not. I had been concerned about those 3 from the start. The temperature differential on them had never quite normalized, and the shell thickness might indicate arrested development as easily as it indicated stress compensation. 4 out of 7. In another case, I might have called that a poor result. Sitting in that pen at dawn on the second day with 4 living hatchlings moving around, Senna's curved body, I did not call it that. I called it 4. 4 were alive. I sent my report to the territorial authority at 7 in the morning. I listed the outcome, the clutch count, the status of the mother, the current vitals on each hatchling. I was precise and clinical, and I used the word viable 4 times, once for each hatchling. I used it without italics and without emphasis, because a fact stated in a flat voice carries its own kind of weight. Then, I went back to the pen and sat down against the south wall, in the morning light, and watched the hatchlings explore the 6 square meters of their current world. 2 of them came quite close to me before retreating. The approach was not bold. It was the cautious incremental movement of a young animal testing the edge of what was safe, moving forward and then stopping and then moving again, with the whole body oriented toward retreat if necessary. I recognized the pattern. I stayed very still and kept my hands visible and my eyes slightly averted, the same approach I had used with their mother on the first morning. 2 of them came quite close to me before retreating. One stopped at about an arm's length and looked at me with eyes that were the same pale amber as their mother's, very wide, very still. I stayed still. After a while it turned and went back toward the heat units. Varath Sen watched all of this. She did not interfere. She watched me, and she watched her hatchlings in turns. She made no sound or performed, no action I could interpret as either approval or alarm. She simply watched. By now I knew her watchfulness well enough to know it meant something, that it was not neutral. But I could not have told you what it meant, and I was not going to pretend I could. I went and stood with Varath Sen for a while after Davin left the pen. The hatchlings were asleep by then, all 4 of them tucked against her warmth, and she was in that half-dozed state I had come to recognize. Not fully awake, not fully away. The amber eyes at 1/4. She acknowledged my presence with a small shift of her neck, posture adjusting fractionally to admit me into the periphery of the space without pulling away from it. I sat there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, not doing anything particular, just being the familiar presence. That was what I had to offer that morning, so that was what I gave. I went to do the morning rounds of the other pens. I had let myself fall slightly behind on the other cases in the final hatching days. Not in any way that had caused harm, but enough that the draft animals needed more attention than the routine check, and the older working animal recovering from the joint procedure needed its medication adjusted. I spent a full hour on those cases, doing the work carefully because those animals deserved exactly the same quality of attention as the one that had just hatched 4 hatchlings. Quality of care does not scale with how impressive the case is. A draft animal with hoof rot deserves the same presence as anything else, and I gave it. There were 3 other cases in the facility at that time. A juvenile border breed with a respiratory infection, a pair of draft animals with hoof rot, and an older working animal recovering from a joint procedure I had done the previous month. I attended to all of them. I ate something. I wrote up the supply request for the additional feed needed for 4 hatchlings and a nursing mother. I checked the temperature records. I did the work. It was around mid-afternoon when Davin came to find me in the supply room. He stood in the doorway and said, "Mara," which is what he calls me when something is serious. "You should come outside." I looked up at him. His expression was not alarmed. It was something closer to careful. The expression he uses when he is not sure how to describe what he has seen, when the thing itself will serve better than any description he could offer. "What is it?" "Outside," he said. "Just come and see." I followed him through the triage bay and out through the wide south doors. The wind was coming off the reaches from the east, carrying the dry smell of the territorial scrubland. The dirt pad was empty. The open ground ran south toward the border markers, where the scraggly line of marker poles stood against the late afternoon sky. The shadow was on the ground before I registered its source. It was a large shadow and it was moving. I looked up. He was dropping altitude in a long, controlled descent, wings angled back at the adjustment point. That means a landing is intended. He was enormous. I have seen Vareth lineage animals over the years and some large ones among them. But this was a different order of large, the kind that makes you immediately and involuntarily aware of the smallness of things that are not it. The wingspan, at the angle he was carrying it, close to 30 meters. The coloration was slate gray at the base with gold along the leading wing edges and the dorsal ridge. That dense overlay of elder scutes over secondary scales that the older Varath carry, the physical record of considerable age. He moved with the economy of complete command over his own body, no excess, no drama, just the precise management of enormous mass, through a medium that happened to hold it. He set down on the open ground about 60 meters south of the pen complex. The impact carried through the ground and up through the soles of my boots. Dust came up in a ring around his landing position and drifted east on the wind. He folded his wings in 2 clean movements and was still. He looked at me. I have thought about that moment a great deal since, not with any attempt to make it into something it was not. I am aware that I am a person with a limited capacity for interpreting the internal states of creatures, very different from myself, and that the dramatic version of that moment would be larger than the version I actually experienced. What I experienced was the sudden awareness of being the specific object of attention from something that had every reason and every capacity to look at anything it chose, and had chosen to look at me. That awareness was not comfortable, and it was not frightening. It was clarifying in the way that a very clean, cold piece of weather is clarifying. It did not tell me anything I did not already know, but it made what I knew very specific. I stood in the south triage bay doorway, with Davin 2 steps behind me, and I looked back at him. A few seconds neither of us did anything at all. His eyes were the same pale amber as Vareth Sen's, as the hatchlings, with a depth the others did not have. The amber of something very old and very clear, like looking into water that is both completely transparent and very deep. The eye itself was large, proportional to the rest of him, and it was pointed directly at me, with the kind of focus that has no self-consciousness in it. He was simply looking. Inside the secondary pen, I heard Varath Sen make a sound. Not the chest sound I knew. Something different, lower and longer, the quality I had no word for. A frequency I felt more than heard, traveling up through the ground and through the soles of my feet. I had never heard her make that sound before. It had the character of an acknowledgement, or something like a report given to someone who was owed one. I had no vocabulary for it. I registered it, he heard it. His attention moved briefly toward the pen, and something in his posture shifted, very slightly, in a way I cannot adequately describe, except to say that it reminded me of a person receiving a piece of news they had been waiting, something settling into place. Then his attention returned to me and stayed there. He was not threatening. I want to be precise about that, because it matters, and because it would be easy to reconstruct the memory, as frightening in retrospect. What was actually true was that there was no threat in him. There was attention and immensity, and something else. Something I did not have a word for at the time, and am not certain I have one for now. He was looking at me the way you look at something you need to understand, with complete focus and without hurry. After perhaps a minute, he did something I was not prepared for. He lowered his head, not to the ground, not the full, formal bow posture I had read about in the Vareth lineage references. What he did was somewhere between a nod and a bow, the head dropping to an angle clearly below the horizontal and holding there for several seconds, before rising again. It was deliberate. It was not casual movement. I did not know the correct response to this. I have no formal training in Vareth interspecies protocol, and the academic references I own are descriptive rather than instructional. I did what I would do if a person made a gesture I didn't fully understand, but that was clearly respectful. I inclined my own head, briefly, and looked back at him. The corner of his jaw moved. A sound came, a series of sounds, structured, some in the audible range, and some clearly below or above it. The kind of vocalization that I knew from my references indicated formal address in the Vareth lineage. I could not parse the meaning. What I had was the impression of something being said with care, and at length, something that was not abbreviated or casual. It took time when he stopped. The sound of the wind through the marker poles was very loud in the following silence. Davin, behind me, said very quietly, "I think he's naming you. Why do you think that?" The lower register. The one that repeats at intervals. There's a naming register in formal Vareth address. I read a little about it after she arrived. It carries a repeating tonal anchor, a low frequency that recurs at regular intervals through the sequence. It's the grammatical spine of the name. I heard it repeat. He paused. I thought about what I had read. The naming register in formal Vareth address does carry that anchor, a bass note recurring at regular intervals through the full sequence. "How many intervals did you count?" I asked. He thought for a moment. 4. "I counted 4 as well," I said. The ancient was watching me with those amber eyes, patient and entirely still. Behind him, the afternoon light was catching the gold along his dorsal ridge, and the leading edges of his folded wings. And the dust from his landing was still drifting slowly east on the wind, and the border marker poles were dark sticks against the pale sky with their usual indifferent sound. The world was exactly what it had always been, and completely different at the same time. I did not know how to hold both of those things at once, so I stood in the doorway and held them separately and waited. From the secondary pen came the sound of a hatchling vocalizing. Very small, very clear, unmistakable. The ancient's eyes moved toward the pen for a moment, and that subtle shift in his posture came again. Something quiet and complicated, something I was not equipped to interpret, but registered in the way you register whose names you don't yet have. I thought about the assessors. I thought about the word non-viable, and how smoothly it had come out of that man's mouth. I thought about the notes he had made standing at the gate, and the transport lifting off with its clean boots. Thought about the 7 eggs in the corner of the pen and the shell percussion that Davon had been recording for weeks. That small, irregular, internal percussion that is the sound of something working to exist. I thought about Vareth Sene in the afternoon light, her scales moving through copper and bronze and old gold, the long curve of her neck toward those eggs in their corner, the body keeping its own counsel. I thought about a hatchling stopping at an arm's length from me and looking up with pale amber eyes, very wide, very still, deciding what I was. I turned to Davon. "Make sure all the hatching records are in order," I said. "The temperature logs, the clinical notes, the percussion records, the intake documentation from the day she arrived. Everything." "It already is," he said. He had been keeping those records as carefully as I had, I knew that. I said it anyway, because it needed saying, but because I needed to say something, to stand in the doorway and say one ordinary practical thing, while the world was different. "Good," I said. I turned back to the ancient. He performed the vocalization again, the same structured sequence, the same 4-interval anchor, careful and deliberate. I listened for the full length of it. When he finished, I inclined my head again, the same inclination as before. It was all I had and I gave it. After a while he spread his wings. Everything he did was considered. No sudden movements, no performance. He lifted from the open ground with the sweep of those enormous wings, the dust coming up around his departure point and drifting east. He climbed against the pale late afternoon sky with complete command, the slate and gold shape, growing smaller without diminishing, the gold along his wing edges catching the direct sun for a moment. Brilliant. And then he was gone into the blue above the reaches. Davin and I stood in the doorway for another minute, looking south at the empty sky. The marker poles were dark shapes against the fading light. The wind kept moving through them. He knew she was here, Davin said eventually. He knew from the beginning. Yes, I said, I think so. And he waited. He didn't come until after the eggs hatched. He was watching to see, I said. He was quiet for a moment. What do you think he was watching for? I had thought about this while he was still overhead. The best answer I had was not certain, but it was the most honest. He wanted to know what this post was. What happened inside my secondary pen? Whether the thing that had come to me, whether by accident or by choice or by both, had been kept or abandoned. He had watched until he had an answer. And the answer had been given in the record of 6 weeks and 7 eggs and 4 alive. In the temperature logs, and the percussion notes, and the splinting rig adapted from materials in a supply room that was never full enough, he had watched until he knew what kind of place this was, and what kind of person ran it. I did not say all of this to Davon, I said. Don't know for certain. Which was accurate as far as certainty went. We went back inside. There was still most of an afternoon's work remaining. I did the evening treatment on the juvenile with the respiratory infection. I changed the dressings on the draft animals. I wrote up the incident report, the time, the duration, the nature of the vocalization as I had observed it, Davon's assessment and mine together, the 4-interval count, the landing location, the wingspan estimate, the lineage markings. I wrote it with the same precision I gave everything in the station's records, because the record is the record, and it deserves that. Then, I went back to the secondary pen for the evening check. Vareth Sen was in her usual position along the south wall. The hatchlings were arranged around her in their near-circular sleeping formation, the 4 of them making a rough ring around the warmest point. Under the heat units, the amber eyes closed or half-closed, small wings folded. The one that had come closest to me was at the outermost edge of the cluster. It opened its eyes when I came in and watched me cross to the south wall. I sat down in my place. The heat units hummed. The last of the light was still coming through the wide south doors, lower now, the band across the floor narrowing. Vareth Sen looked at me. Amber eyes were clear and steady. Not the calculating look of that first morning. Not wariness, something simpler than either. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she put her head down, the long neck settling into its curved arc. The posture that said, "We are here. We are well." The posture that had come to mean, for me, something like "You may rest." Davin brought me something warm around the time the last light hate faded from the floor. Set it down near me without comment. Went to go up the trash bay for the night. I sat a while longer after he left. The hatchling at the outer edge of the cluster kept its eyes open for most of that time, watching me with that wide amber attention, not alarmed, just watching. Eventually, its eyes closed. I thought about the 4-interval anchor and what it designated in the Vareth lineage tongue. I could look it up. My references had a section on naming registers, and Davin had already been reading them. Maybe we would find it. Maybe this section would not cover this particular register. Either way, I knew what I had heard, and I knew what I had been told the anchor meant, and I knew what I had done in the 6 weeks preceding it. Whether the name itself changed what I did tomorrow was a question I already knew the to which was that it did not. Tomorrow I would get up, check the pens, do the work. The work was, 4 hatchlings alive, 1 mother alive, covering her wing ribs in better geometry than the day she arrived. 7 eggs in that corner, through 6 weeks of temperature logs and clinical notes and percussion ran morning arrivals, without exception, and all of it documented in the station's records where it would stay. I finished the cup. I stood up and stretched the ache out of my lower back, which has been a regular companion for about 4 years, and which I have accepted as part of the landscape of this life. I picked up my kit. The hatchling at the outer edge of the cluster opened its eyes when I moved, watched me all the way to the pen gate, and then closed them again. "Good night," I said, because I always say something when I leave. They know the sound of a voice even when they don't know the words, and the sound of a known voice at a departure is a kind of assurance. That costs nothing, and I give it freely. I latched the gate. The lock clicked. I walked back through the triage bay, past the supply room, past the office with its stacked paperwork, and the annual review notification filed in its folder. I made a meal and ate it standing at the window that faces south, looking at the pen complex in the dark. Faint, warm glow of the heat units visible at the edges of the wide south doors. 4 alive. I washed up. I set my alarm for the 2-hour check. I went to bed. In the morning I got up and went to feed them.